Hello guys, today we will talk about coding corporate standards for Salesforce developers. So when we have an IT company and that IT company working with variety of different clients, so the code quality that that company produce should be on the appropriate level. So to make sure that every developer who is working for that company actually providing that level of code quality, we have a different kind of processes, and one of the let's say biggest alignments that should be between that IT company and between the client, right? Is that that code quality that is provided by that company is good, right? So then it's rely on that company, let's say management, to make sure that this specific IT company have appropriate corporate coding standards and guidelines. So that means that let's imagine that we are in following position. IT company working with a couple of clients, right? And those clients actually don't have any kind of IT department. So that means that like all code that is provided via that company, like at this moment, like not sometimes, like you review it from that side because there are nobody who could actually review it, right? But they're testing it, like and making sure that in terms of the functional perspective, everything is working good, right? But some other clients, let's say, have their own AT teams. And when that AT company produce any kind of code or would like to merge something into the JIT, right, there might be also, like additional reviewer from the client side. And if the reviewer from the client side will be able to see that, like there are a lot of code which is coming up and that code is not, let's say, was created accordingly to Salesforce best practices and the naming convention is different, like in a lot of this stuff, so of course there will be questions. So for you, as for IT company, right, or for a developer who working for the specific company, to make sure that you're producing code with the right quality, right, accordingly to some corporate standards and all this stuff, you need to make sure that you actually following corporate coding standards. So what is actually the document, right? Corporate coding standards. It's actually a document that should include into itself different kind of chapters. So first chapter is related to naming convention. So that means that every kind of code that we actually trying to create as a part of our development should be aligned in terms of what kind of naming convention we are using, like between developers. So that means that, for example, let me show you some example. Like naming convention for the classes should be like this, and naming convention for the unit test classes should be like this. So you could see that keyword test, right, in the name of the unit test class should be at the end, right? So there should be no, let's say, underscores, right, or there should not be, let's say, word test at the beginning and all this stuff. Because if different developers will, let's say, create different kind of code, right, accordingly to different naming convention, it's definitely will be, let's say, confusing, right, and it will be not so easy, like then find related classes just, like when you're observing them in the, for example, Visual Studio Code and all this stuff. So it will make sure that, like all of kind of naming convention of constants, methods, fields, variables, applications, Lightning components, OmniScript items, like all this stuff will be aligned to the corporate standards. So next one is actual coding standards. So regarding to coding standards, there might be different kind of techniques that that specific company is actually use, like to make sure that that specific, let's say, way how they build in the code is, like align it and that it's, like accordingly to some, let's say, good level or accordingly to the best practices. So in that case, just some examples, right? For example, avoiding querying of not deterministic formula fields in SQL query, right? When we're doing, for example, unit test to make sure that we are covering positive, negative testing, that we are doing bulk testing, like we have assertion and all this stuff. So also, like it's related to, the way how we are working with the triggers, what kind of, like frameworks we are applying, what kind of, like configuration layer we are applying and all this stuff. So it's really, like depend on what is best practices, right? And what is, like company standards accordingly to those best practices. Let's say, for example, if we should have configurable features, then in coding standards it should be mentioned, okay, so, like every features that we are doing, it should be, like related to some custom settings or whatever, something like this. Also, it should contain information that we should not hard code IDs. Let me show you some basic examples, like avoid SQL queries in DML, bulkify the code, avoiding hard coding IDs, like and all this stuff. So all these should be divided and should be, let's say, in the chapter, right? It's also related to the way how we are actually doing our code. Let's say, should it be just a functional code or should we use, for example, interfaces or wherever, right? All that part should be covered here. So next one is related to code security and safety. So of course, if in our corporate standards, we will have defined as a chapter, right? So that every developer in our company will be able to make sure that the code that they are producing, it's at least, like following some specific security code standards. So here we could, for example, specify that our code should pass from the PMD, right, in terms of the security checks. It's, for example, should not contain SQL injections, and we could define here, like already what is, like our basic practices for this, right? How to handle that kind of security issues. And in that case, our developers, like even if they are not too, like experienced, let's say junior developers, they will anyway understand, right? If it will be marked in the corporate guidelines that, they should follow this rule, they will follow, right? So next one is, like related to declarative development. So in that case, so what we are doing, right, we would like to align in terms of what kind of automation tools we are using on the project, right? What is, like the common pattern, let's say one flow per object or a couple of flows. So what is the naming, let's say naming convention around it? What kind of logic we should still have it, right? Or for example, here we could have defined rules, like for example, if in our flow we need to work within more than 2,000 of records, so then we need to convert it into the asynchronously working flow, or invoke some, for example, epics, right? And epics will be able to handle this. Because if, for example, some a junior developer will try to work in the flow, right, with more than 2,000 of records, so there will be CPU and, like all this stuff. So just from the beginning, to avoid that kind of, like additional time that will be spent, like to realize it for each of the developers by themselves, right, we could put, those scenarios into our corporate coding guideline, and it will indicate that point. So next one is related to frameworks. So wherever frameworks we are applying for, like everything what is our company produce, should be documented there. So let me show you some example of what is potentially could be here. So one of the items is related to automation framework, right? Automation framework is something which is actually helping us at any point of time disable any kind of automation on any kind of our object. So basic idea here is we are creating, as how it's mentioned here, a hierarchical custom setting, and that custom setting is used to determine wherever automation is disabled and for whom, right? Because when we are using hierarchical custom setting, we can like use it for different profiles, and we could use general settings, like for example, as you could see here, account trigger disabled, account validations disabled, account workflow rules, right? And all this stuff we could actually use on our trigger level, and then we could specify like what exactly we would like to enable or disable at which specific point of time. So for example, we are doing some kind of data upload, right? So we will be able to do it in the centralized place, right? And if there are any kind of other operations will be required, it also will be possible with just that simple, let's say, checkbox, right? As you could see, we are looking for our automation, right? And our, let's say, automation settings actually can control wherever is required for us. So we can then put it wherever we need, as well in the trigger. So next possible framework, right, it might be, for example, trigger framework. So in that case, for example, when we have a trigger, right, on the specific object, so then we, for example, have some dispatcher. In the dispatcher, we are, like defining if our trigger is disabled or not, and then, like we are handling different kind of operations. And when the specific operation is here, like for example, if it's before and before insert, so then we are invoking the specific function from the handler. So our handler is located here. And for that handler, for example, we could prepare an interface. That interface will actually dictate for that specific class what exactly methods need to be provided. And then, like in the implementation of that class, we have, for example, this before update, right? And we have, the same parameters that we have. Where is this before update? Yeah, what we have specified in our interface, right? And in that case, we could make sure that every kind of our object, right, that we have in the system, and any kind of the trigger will be able, to follow the same interface, right? And in that case, the same pattern will be applied, and we will be able to control the number of, like triggers that we have in our project. And it's, like also will show, like the level of our company, that we are not producing, let's say, tons triggers per object, right? That will mean that we are following the specific standards. All right, so next items, right, which might be included into the corporate coding guidelines, it's the way how we are defining definition of done for the user stories, right, and definition of readiness. So at this moment, as for developers, we are mostly interested in the definition of done because it's sometimes related to the documentation, right? And if developer, when they completed some work, they have to provide, for example, documentation for that feature. So in that case, we could define here what is, like structure of that documentation, right? How we should, for example, document our pull request, how we should document our classes, how we should document our Confluence pages, and what exactly information we need to include inside of it. So in that case, we will be able to make sure that like the appropriate level of documentation will be provided, and that every developer will understand like what exactly they need to document. Let's say Apex classes need to be documented, any kind of object field, right? Everywhere where we have description, we need to document. Let's say what is the purpose, like of that specific item and why it was created. So when we define it, right, that where we have existing use corporate coding standards, right, we could think, let's say, how we could let's say apply it in our company, right? How we could everyone to like ask everyone to go through this document, right, and make sure that it's like applied. So there are a couple of like different ways how we could do it. So one of them is when we are doing some kind of project onboarding. So when we have a situation when, for example, our customer have their own IT team and their own corporate coding standards, so in that case they could provide the document, right? And wherever we will have that specific onboarding process for our developer, so that developer will be able to learn that company, let's say, coding standards, right? They could be different. So for example, they name a variable differently, right, or accordingly to their corporate standards because they have different teams, different namespaces, right? And you need to always apply some specific namespace. Maybe in terms of like custom settings, maybe they're using custom metadata and all this stuff, right? It could be documented in their corporate coding standards guide, right? And usually, let's say those docs could be quite big, right? Let's say about 100 of pages. But it's, let's say, if you have some experience in development, it's definitely like will be possible for you to read it in 1 or 2 days. And even it's not sometimes like totally required for you to go through entire document. Let's say if you have to create an object, name some fields somehow, you're going just to this document, right? Check a naming convention for object and application, and you do your stuff, right? When it's related to Apex, so then you are going to this document, right? And for example, if you have to do some kind of query on the large data set, right? You from here you could see what is the general advice, like for example, to not exceed heap limit, right? In the SQL query, you could use SQL for loop, right, instead of regular query, right? And in that case, let's say it could proceed multiple batches of records, right, using internal calls to query and use query more, right? So that's specific. Or for example, when they will write any kind of SQL query, right, how to format that specific query. If it's, let's say, very long, and what is the, let's say, basic consideration around it. So all this stuff could be actually found in that corporate guideline, and the developer will be able to investigate them. But if not, right, and let's say in that case, it's rely on the company, right, for whom that specific developer is working, to make sure that he's like familiar with corporate coding standards. And in that case, let's say there are a couple of ways, right? One of the ways to make sure that that specific, let's say, team members will follow the standards, right? It's to have pull request review. So when we have pull request review process, right, so that means that somebody who is more experienced will need to make sure that that code is, like looking good, that it's follow corporate code guidelines as well, and that it's passing, for example, some PMD check, wherever, right, accordingly to your project and processes inside. So in that case, that person will be able to review it, right, put any kind of review comments, and for example, will send that person again, to the onboarding, not to onboarding, to the corporate standards document. It's one way, right? Second one is to give it to the developer once that person is just onboarded in general for that company, right? It's second way. And third way, it's, like if you would like to include different chapters from that specific document for different layers of education of our employees. Let's imagine that we have, like three grades, like junior, middle, and senior in our company, and we have a couple of skills, right? And one of the skills is, like the person should know our corporate guideline. So in that case, for example, when we're providing that the junior should know level 1, right? So that means that, for example, he should know how to format SQL queries, he should know how to, that it's not that it's required to not hard code in like IDs, and like write unit tests at some appropriate level and all this stuff, right? So it's like might be enough for juniors in that company. So more advanced level, like level 2, right, might be related to possibility to create a batches, follow the specific practices, and so on and so forth. And for seniors, right, it might be related to a different kind of frameworks. Of course, like you could decide on your organization, right? Maybe like you would like for even juniors, like to know entire coding guideline, right, and for them to already follow it. So in that case, you could assign it like this. So it's like all possible, but like usual practice is to do something like this, or in general just give it like to any person who is on board in our company or on board in the specific process. So I think we already like took some examples from that specific document, right, and what could be specified here. So we already reviewed automation framework and possibility enable and disable any kind of automation on our environment. So trigger framework, we also cover it. So like next item which might be covered here as well, it might be login framework. Let's say any kind of code that we're producing in our organization should have error handling, right? When we're doing error handling, so then we are doing login framework. When we are doing a login framework, we, for example, using big object, and in big object we are putting any kind of our internal errors, right? And when we're doing internal errors based on the record type, we are defining, let's say, what it should be, like our action based on that record to be inserted. If it's integration, for example, failures, then send the specific message to the integration team, and so on and so forth. So there might be like different chapters. There could be different information, right? But for you to just understand, like that document might be very big, and it's definitely something that it's really cool to have for organization. So at this moment, guys, thank you for the attention, and put into the comments under that video if you already have in your organization that kind of document.